Questions of the meaning of life and the reality of mortality were impossible to ignore. Science didn't help me much here.
He spent his career proving God didn't exist, but what he found left even his peers speechless. Dr. Francis Collins led the Human Genome Project, mapping the entire genetic blueprint of humanity. He called himself an obnoxious atheist in his younger years, believing science had all the answers. But something happened during his medical training that changed everything. The evidence he discovered didn't just surprise him, it completely transformed his understanding of reality and led him on a journey he never expected to take. Follow along, as his story might just change how you see faith. The brilliant atheist. Dr. Francis Collins wasn't just any scientist. This man became one of the most respected geneticists in the entire world. He earned both a medical degree and a doctorate in physical chemistry from Yale University. His credentials are genuinely impressive. Collins led the groundbreaking Human Genome Project from 1993 to 2003, successfully mapping all 3 billion letters of human DNA. Think about that for a moment. He literally helped decode the instruction manual for human life. But here's what makes his story so fascinating. During his college years and graduate studies, Collins was a firm atheist. He grew up in a home where faith wasn't discussed much at all. His father was a drama professor, his mother a playwright. They created this wonderful environment filled with art, music, and theatre, but religion simply never entered the conversation. It wasn't rejected or looked down upon. It just wasn't there. When Collins entered graduate school studying quantum mechanics, he felt completely confident in his worldview. Science could explain everything, he thought. Any question about life, the universe, or existence could ultimately be reduced to physics and chemistry. There was no need for God in his understanding of reality. He even admitted later that he was somewhat obnoxious about his atheism during those years. Nothing in his academic training suggested he would ever change his mind. He was climbing the ranks of the scientific community, surrounded by other brilliant minds who mostly shared his skeptical views. Faith seemed like something for people who hadn't thought deeply enough about the world. Collins believed he had thought it through completely, and his conclusion was clear. There was no God. The crisis that started everything. But then Collins made a decision that would alter the entire trajectory of his life. After finishing his graduate work in quantum mechanics, he realized something troubling. The work felt too abstract, too disconnected from real human concerns. He was dealing with particles and equations, but he wanted to help actual people. So he made an unusual choice for someone with his background. He decided to attend medical school. Medical school brought Collins face to face with something his physics equations never prepared him for: human suffering. As a young medical student and later as a resident physician, he encountered patients dealing with devastating diseases. Some faced terminal illnesses with no hope of recovery. The reality of pain, death, and human fragility surrounded him every single day in the hospital. What shocked Collins was how many of his patients responded to their suffering. Instead of falling apart or becoming bitter, many of them displayed remarkable peace. They talked openly about their faith, giving them strength during the darkest moments. These weren't weak-minded or uneducated people. Many were intelligent, thoughtful individuals who genuinely believed their relationship with God helped them endure terrible circumstances. One particular encounter changed everything for Collins. He was caring for an elderly woman with a serious heart condition. Her prognosis was poor, and she knew it. But instead of despair, she radiated this unusual calmness. She spoke about how her faith sustained her through fear and uncertainty. Then she looked directly at Collins and asked him a simple question: "What do you believe, doctor?" That question hit him like a physical blow. Collins stood there stunned. He realized he had no real answer. This brilliant scientist, who prided himself on evidence-based thinking, had never actually examined the evidence for or against God's existence. The search begins. That moment in the hospital room haunted Collins. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with his approach. Here he was, a scientist who constantly insisted on evidence and careful analysis. Yet he had arrived at one of the most important conclusions possible: that God doesn't exist, without ever really investigating the question. The hypocrisy bothered him deeply. Collins described feeling determined to search for actual evidence about faith, but he was also resistant. Part of him hoped that looking at the evidence would simply strengthen his atheism and put the question to rest forever. He expected to find that religious belief was wishful thinking with no solid foundation. Then he could go back to his comfortable skepticism, this time with confidence that he had actually done the work. He found a Methodist pastor who lived on his street. This pastor seemed like a reasonable, thoughtful person, not a wild-eyed fanatic. Collins remembers making an appointment and then unleashing all his questions and objections. He asked the hard questions that had kept him from faith. He probably said things the pastor found blasphemous or offensive, but the pastor listened patiently and didn't get defensive. The pastor suggested Collins might benefit from reading about Christianity from people who had wrestled with similar doubts. Then he pulled a small book off his shelf. It was Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, the famous Oxford scholar. The pastor told Collins that Lewis had traveled a very similar path from atheism to belief, fighting it the whole way. Something about that appealed to Collins. Here was another intellectual, someone from a prestigious university, who had examined these questions seriously. The book that changed everything. Collins took the book home with mixed feelings. He expected to find weak arguments that he could easily dismiss. Instead, what he discovered in those pages completely blindsided him. Within just the first 3 pages of Mere Christianity, Collins had a shocking realization. All of his arguments against faith were, in his own words, those of a schoolboy. The confident objections he had carried for years suddenly seemed shallow and unexamined. C.S. Lewis presented arguments Collins had never seriously considered. The book didn't rely on emotional appeals or asking readers to ignore their intellect. Instead, Lewis built a logical case piece by piece. He addressed exactly the kinds of objections Collins had been holding on to, but more importantly, he revealed blind spots in Collins's thinking that the scientist hadn't even recognized were there. This was deeply uncomfortable for Collins. His entire identity was wrapped up in being rational, evidence-based, and intellectually honest. Discovering that he had accepted atheism without genuine investigation felt like a personal failure. He realized he needed to continue his search much more seriously. If he was going to reject God, it had to be based on actual examination of the evidence, not just assumptions. Collins spent the next 2 years on an intense intellectual journey. He read extensively about different worldviews and philosophies. He studied the historical evidence for Jesus Christ's life and teachings. He examined arguments from multiple perspectives. Collins approached the question with the same rigor he brought to his scientific research. He wanted truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. The evidence from the universe. As Collins dug deeper into the evidence, he began noticing something remarkable. The same scientific knowledge he had used to support atheism could actually point in a completely different direction. The first major piece of evidence that struck him was simply the existence of anything at all. Why is there something rather than nothing? Science had no answer to that fundamental question. The universe had a beginning. The Big Bang theory, supported by massive amounts of evidence, tells us that space, time, matter, and energy all came into existence at a specific point, roughly 13.8 billion years ago. But what caused that initial moment? What existed before the Big Bang? Physics breaks down at that point. The laws of nature, as we understand them, didn't exist yet. So, what was the cause of the universe itself? Collins also became fascinated by what scientists call the fine-tuning of the universe. The physical constants that govern reality are set to incredibly precise values. If the strength of gravity were slightly different, stars couldn't form. If the electromagnetic force was just a bit stronger or weaker, atoms couldn't bond properly to create the chemistry necessary for life. The speed of light, the mass of electrons, the expansion rate of the universe, dozens of these constants all had to be exactly right for any interesting complexity to emerge. The precision required is genuinely staggering. Some of these values are fine-tuned to 1 part in billions or even trillions. It's like throwing a dart from space and hitting a specific atom on Earth. Many prominent physicists have acknowledged this mystery. Some have suggested the multiverse theory, that countless other universes exist with different physical constants, and we just happen to be in one of the rare ones that works. But Collins found that explanation less satisfying than the possibility that the universe was intentionally designed. The mathematical mystery. Collins had always loved mathematics. During his physics training, he was captivated by elegant equations that described natural phenomena. But now he started asking a different question. Why does nature follow mathematical rules at all? Why should the universe be comprehensible through mathematics? This isn't obvious. Reality could have been completely chaotic and random. Instead, we discover that nature follows beautiful, precise mathematical patterns. Albert Einstein once said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Many famous scientists and mathematicians have expressed similar wonder. Why should human minds, which evolved for survival on the African savanna, be able to understand quantum mechanics or general relativity? Why can we write down equations that accurately predict the behavior of objects billions of light years away? Collins began to see this as a potential signpost pointing toward a rational mind behind reality. If the universe was created by an intelligent being, what he started thinking of as a great mathematician and physicist, then it would make sense that creation reflects mathematical order. The laws of physics would be expressions of that creator's thoughts, so to speak. This resonated with Collins in a profound way. But he still wrestled with questions. Even if some kind of God existed to start the universe and set its physical constants, that didn't necessarily mean that God cared about human beings. Maybe God was more like a cosmic watchmaker who wound up the universe and then walked away. Collins wasn't satisfied with a distant, impersonal deity. He wanted to know if there was evidence for a God who was actually interested in humanity's well-being. The moral law. This is where C.S. Lewis's argument hit Collins with particular force. Lewis wrote about what he called the moral law, this universal human awareness of right and wrong. In every culture throughout history, people have recognized certain moral truths. Murder is wrong. Honesty is good. Protecting the vulnerable matters. Betraying trust is bad. These aren't just opinions or social conventions. They feel deeply true to us. Collins found this argument especially compelling as a scientist. Evolution could potentially explain many aspects of human behavior. We evolved to form social groups, to cooperate, to care for our offspring. These traits helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. But the moral law sometimes demands actions that seem to contradict evolutionary self-interest. If you see someone drowning, moral intuition says you should try to help them, even if you risk your own life. That doesn't serve your genetic survival. The universality of moral awareness across all human cultures suggested to Collins that something beyond evolution was at work. Different societies have different customs and practices, true. But underlying those surface differences are remarkably consistent moral foundations. The idea that courage is admirable, that cruelty is wrong, that justice matters, these transcend cultural boundaries. Where did this common moral knowledge come from? Collins began to think that the existence of objective morality pointed toward a moral lawgiver. If the universe was purely material, just atoms moving according to physical laws, then morality would be nothing more than personal preference or social conditioning. There would be no real difference between right and wrong, just different opinions. But our deep intuition rebels against that idea. We feel in our bones that some things truly are wrong and some truly are right. Collins concluded that this moral dimension of human experience suggested something beyond the purely physical, the historical evidence. Collins had been avoiding one particular area of investigation. When he first started examining religious claims, he hoped it wouldn't lead to Christianity specifically. That seemed too obvious, too culturally expected. Surely, if there was a God, the truth would be found in some more exotic or unexpected place. But as he continued his research, he kept running into evidence about Jesus Christ that he couldn't easily dismiss. The historical case for Jesus surprised Collins. He had assumed that the gospel accounts were largely mythological, written centuries after the events they described. But historians who study ancient documents paint a very different picture. The earliest Christian writings, like Paul's letters, date to within 20 to 30 years of Jesus' death. The Gospels were written within a single generation. That's remarkably early for ancient historical documents. We have more manuscript evidence for the New Testament than for virtually any other ancient text. There are thousands of Greek manuscripts, plus translations into other ancient languages. This allows scholars to reconstruct the original texts with high confidence. In contrast, most of what we know about ancient figures like Julius Caesar comes from far fewer sources written long after their deaths. Yet historians treat those sources as generally reliable. The historical evidence indicates that Jesus was a real person who lived in 1st century Palestine, gathered followers, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and whose disciples claimed he rose from the dead. Early Christians were so convinced of the resurrection that they were willing to face persecution and death rather than recant their testimony. Collins found it difficult to explain this early Christian movement if the resurrection was simply made up. People don't usually die for what they know is a lie. The DNA discovery. As Collins progressed in his genetics career and eventually took on leadership of the Human Genome Project, his Christian faith deepened rather than conflicted with his science. In fact, studying DNA strengthened his sense of wonder at the complexity of life. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs of DNA. These are the chemical letters that spell out the instructions for building and maintaining a human body. Collins often described DNA as a language or an instruction manual. The 4 chemical bases, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, abbreviated as A, T, G, and C, are arranged in precise sequences. These sequences code for proteins, regulate gene expression, and contain the information needed to create every cell type in your body. The sophistication of this system is breathtaking. What struck Collins was the sheer amount of information encoded in DNA. If you printed out the human genome in regular-sized text, it would fill about 200 telephone books. Yet this incredible database of information is packed into the nucleus of cells, so small you need a microscope to see them. The more Collins learned about molecular biology, the more he saw evidence of an underlying intelligence. He recognized that this argument didn't prove God in a mathematical sense. Evolution through natural selection is a powerful mechanism that can generate complex adaptations over time. Collins accepted the overwhelming evidence for evolution, but he saw evolution as the method God used to create the diversity of life. The fact that life could emerge and develop through natural processes didn't eliminate God. It revealed how God chose to work. The conversion moment. Collins's journey of investigation eventually led him to a moment of decision. All the intellectual arguments, all the evidence he had gathered, all the questions he had wrestled with for 2 years came to a head. It happened during a hiking trip in the Cascade Mountains. Collins was walking alone when he came upon a beautiful frozen waterfall. 3 streams of water had frozen as they cascaded down the rock, forming 3 separate columns of ice side by side. The image reminded him of the Christian concept of the Trinity. God as 3 persons in one being, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This wasn't a logical proof. Collins knew that. It was more like a moment of clarity where all his intellectual conclusions aligned with his heart. The resistance he had been carrying melted away. He realized he believed, not just in some abstract cosmic force, but in the God described in the Bible, in Jesus Christ who claimed to be God incarnate. Standing there on that mountain trail, Collins made a decision. He knelt down in the mud and committed his life to following Jesus. It was a deeply personal moment that marked the end of his atheism and the beginning of a new chapter. Collins described it as surrendering to God after a long struggle against that very surrender. He had been afraid of what belief might cost him, how it might change his life or affect his career. But in that moment, Collins felt an overwhelming sense of peace and rightness. The intellectual journey had brought him to the edge. This final step was choosing to trust what the evidence seemed to point toward, even though it meant embracing mystery and things he couldn't fully understand. Science had shown him limits to what could be known through experiment and observation alone. Faith didn't contradict his scientific knowledge. It filled in dimensions of reality that science couldn't access. Life after conversion. Francis Collins's conversion to Christianity in his late 20s led him to seek harmony between his scientific work and his faith. He faced doubts from both scientists and Christians, Yet he believed that science and religion address different kinds of questions, science explaining how things work, and faith exploring why they matter. In his book, The Language of God, Collins shared the evidence that shaped his belief and encouraged mutual respect between scientific and religious communities. He later founded the BioLogos Foundation to promote dialogue between science and Christianity, emphasizing that accepting evolution and other scientific findings does not conflict with Christian belief. As director of the National Institutes of Health from 2009 to 2021, Collins became one of the most influential scientists in the United States. His faith guided his ethical positions on genetic research and human dignity, influencing policies like the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he worked closely with Dr. Anthony Fauci to coordinate vaccine development and public health responses. Collins has often said that his faith provided strength during these challenges and helped him see science as a tool for serving humanity. His life shows that intellectual integrity and religious faith can coexist within a shared pursuit of truth. Dr. Francis Collins went from calling himself an obnoxious atheist to becoming a committed follower of Jesus Christ. His journey wasn't driven by emotion or cultural pressure. It was the result of an honest investigation into evidence that he couldn't ignore. The fine-tuning of the universe, the mystery of consciousness and morality, the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, and the incredible complexity of DNA all pointed him toward belief in God. Collins shows us that faith and science don't have to be enemies. They can work together to reveal different aspects of truth about reality and our place in it. What do you think about Collins' journey? Could the evidence he found convince you, or do you see things differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below.